Welcome to the Wellspring, where the grace of God is bubbling up for you and for all people, wherever you are. The Wellspring Podcast is a digital ministry of Muhlenberg Lutheran Church, coming to you from the friendly city of Harrisonburg, Virginia, where we pray that this time together may truly be a wellspring of God's grace for all people who listen, equipping you with new ways to live out Christ's love.
Welcome to the Wellspring. It's a place for grace and faith in life and you.
Hello there. I'm Pastor Alex Zuber. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as the Associate Pastor of Muhlenberg Lutheran Church, overseeing youth, campus, and young adult ministry. It's so good for us to be together. This is episode number 3, titled Away in the Wilderness, discussing chapters 3 and 4 of the book Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others, by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. Our guest host is Christy Trumbo, a licensed professional counselor who brings her perspective to the process of mapping our response to trauma exposure. Christy's clinical perspective helps us get into the meat of this book. After we've recognized that caregivers can be recipients of secondary trauma, Christy helps us walk through the 16 warning signs of trauma exposure response. It's easy to feel lost in the wilderness of trauma, but there are indeed landmarks that may look familiar and help us find our way in the wilderness. Concluding with a reflection on Luke 4, 1 through 15, we look at a time where Jesus navigated the wilderness himself and find that often the way forward is not always the easy way, but it is the faithful way. But the hope we find in this is that Jesus has navigated this wilderness and walks with each of us wherever we're walking. Once again, welcome to the Wellspring Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Delighted today to welcome our guest for this episode, covering part 2, mapping your response to trauma exposure, covering chapter 3, what is trauma exposure response, and chapter 4, the 16 warning signs of trauma exposure response. Today, our guest host is Christy Trumbo. And Christy, I'm so glad to be able to have a conversation with you and to hear from your experience. If you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why did I invite you to be on this part of the podcast in particular?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And I am a licensed professional counselor, currently working at a nonprofit agency in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and working with a team of people who understand trauma and trauma responses. I've been licensed for 13 years as, let's say, not a second career, but the final career. I finally figured out where I needed to be, but it's an honor to sit with people and to hear their stories. And what ties in, and I know I'm jumping a little bit, but we all have trauma, and we are always not sure where it showed up. And the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual for Mental Health, really changed the definition of PTSD and trauma so that it's not just how it was originally written for those coming back from war who had seen lives taken right in front of them. It is what our world is doing, how it has changed, and how we connect with people. And sometimes just the words that come out of somebody else's mouth can devastate us. So I think that's where we're starting to see all of this come together.
I really appreciate that perspective, because you bring the clinical perspective to a lot of these things, which I think as I began to look at this section in particular about how do we map our trauma exposure response, to me, in my own personal experience with therapy and working with counselors, it has felt like a process in emotional and social cartography. It's been about mapping my responses to things and say, I found myself in this situation. I have no clue how I got here. And I'm working with the counselors that, let's look at the path you took. Let's figure out what were the things that came up along the way and why did you do that? And so I know as I read this section, I was looking to say what kind of experience can we bring to this that I think would benefit the folks that are reading this book and hearing about these different aspects of trauma exposure response. the clinical background that you bring, this understanding of the DSM and all these different ways of being diagnosed with the real pains that can happen, not just in our psyche but in our physical health as well. I appreciate that perspective. I think that's going to be a big help to us, especially loving the New Yorker cartoons that are in here. The cartoon that is there right at the beginning of chapter 4 is a man drowning in the water with the dog on the beach, and it says, "Lassie, get help." And the next panel has Lassie sitting with a counselor. And so this seems to be on our author's mind as well, of saying, hey, a place to get help, while not helpful for the drowning man, may be helpful for you.
Yes.
In the different ways that we're drowning with trauma. And I don't think it's getting too far ahead with when we talk about trauma, because from the introduction we've been talking about this, we are all traumatized. Mm-hmm. We are all bearing that with us. And so thank you for bringing your perspective and your expertise to this as we get into part 2 of mapping our trauma exposure response. I'd like to take a look just at these chapters.
Perfect.
We can walk through it together and talk about what we found here. And what is, and maybe add some more depth for our readers. But we get into chapter 3 first, which is just what is trauma exposure response, this idea of what's been set up here in the first few chapters of our book when we're talking about what trauma stewardship is. Now we're getting into trauma exposure response. And on page 42, she defines this as saying a trauma exposure response has occurred when external trauma becomes internal reality. What does an internal reality like that look like for you in your experience? What kind of things, how have you seen the external trauma become internal reality for folks?
It's a belief system. It's a belief system all its own that myself or others take on. It's how we process. And then in the processing, we add our individuality toward it. Coulda, shoulda, woulda's come up. If they would have, if they could have, or they should have. But then it's also projecting. So when we project of everything that we think someone else might have done, we then are yelling and screaming about what we ourselves are doing. And so that piece of it ties in and becomes our reality. It's hard. It's hard to keep them separate. For a clinician, the language is transference and countertransference. And if we struggle with keeping that in check, we then have crossed a line. We've missed a boundary. However, the catch for that for clinicians is consultation and supervision. We go talk about it. We bring it up with our colleagues to say, I'm struggling with this that I learned about a client. We can bring it back, and then so we know where we are authentically.
I appreciate that point about the sense of identity and the way, and that sense of self, because what you're discussing there is this weird balance of things that are both grounded intimately in the reality of what is happening, but it's also creating all these different alternate realities, and that affects our sense of self, I think. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these, we talk about the way that we are imagining scenarios out and imagining realities that have not happened. Mm-hmm. And that kind of slippery slope of, I think, goes back to this sense of unknowing, of being lost, if wandering in the wilderness to a degree, because we need to map our way out. We need to understand what's going on. And I think that's particularly hard, as she's lifting up here in the book, for helpers.
Yes.
For people who identify as a helper, to get help. I mean, with poor Lassie there was able to get help, but maybe not in the right way. But we can struggle to get help when our identity is so bound in this, because she also says in here, we often assume that our very status as helpers grants us immunity from the suffering we witness. We are often wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the nature of being open-hearted, is you have a capacity to then be wounded by the work you do. what is that kind of thing like, being someone that is in a helping profession, both personally and clinically speaking, that sense of self that's lost in a response to trauma?
And the term gets used too many times, it's normal. However, it doesn't feel normal. I want to jump back to your words real quick, Alex, about being lost in the wilderness. As we say many, many times in our counseling sessions, of the biggest struggle we have is the unknown. That's where fear and anger and many of these 16 trauma exposure responses come from, is the unknown. Where did we pick this up? Where did we look at it differently? Where did we feel? So we want to keep feeling. We want to keep being present with our client. We want to understand. However, sometimes it hits a little close, and that's hard to shake. And then as we leave the space, being able to take a moment and jot down a note or be able to catch it. But it doesn't always happen that way. Alex, I didn't share with you, the first time I learned about this book was 4 years ago through an agency called Nurse Family Partnership. That's where she's quoted in here, someone from the Nurse Family Partnership, and that's where I first learned about this. And these are nurses who go into homes for 3 years to sit with a mother who's getting ready to have a baby up until that child is 3 years old, and what it's like to surround them with all good and positive reinforcements and everything they need. Those nurses take that home with them every day. They're going into those homes. That's where I first learned about all of the trauma stewardship book and where we get triggered. The unknown is we don't always know which piece of information we've heard or seen sits and finds a deep space within us, in our core, that just festers or grows or needs nurturing or needs attention before we can move past it.
I found, in my own experience of going to counseling, those have been some of the most beneficial times for me, where I can walk in and say, where did this come from? Like that thing that hurt me, or that thing that really upset me, or elicited this response, I have no clue where that came from. And so the journey there of mapping it out became really, really important.
Yes.
And really, really helpful for me to understand, why did I get so incredibly overwhelmed by that? Why did I get so angry when XYZ happened? Because it is really important to map it out and get to the root of it. But it is also not easy.
No, not easy at all.
Because, there's a sense of getting over yourself a little bit, which feels like tough love, get over yourself. But it's the reality of this kind of internal work, because we are putting those barriers up for ourselves, I think, as a means of protecting ourselves. But we've also got to get over that to be vulnerable enough to have this kind of conversation.
It is. I'm really struggling to not jump up ahead into chapter 4.
Yeah.
But what I want to affirm there is that little piece that affects us may be a very, very long time ago. And so we don't know. It could be somebody's home that burned down. It could be watching a car accident. And then when we have to meet someone else down the road and they say, yeah, I just had a car accident, so I'm late for school. I just had a car accident, I'm just late for work. And we get triggered, and there are things that we respond to differently, and not necessarily always as a caregiver. But as a mapping response, we have to be able to open up ourselves to be able to say,
Yeah, to know the landmarks. I
All
think
of them.
if we're mapping here, I like this mapping image. We can keep running with that one, because there's landmarks along the way. We get into those in the next chapter with these 16 warning signs, but these are the landmarks that can help us find our way, and they're very individualized. They're very personal. But yeah, I completely agree. Where you say, okay, this thing that I know is part of your story, And I think that's why it's also, I appreciate the work that you do, because sometimes I can't see that for myself, and I need that outside perspective, that person who's been listening and observing and caring to say, ooh, you mentioned a car accident, and I know you told me before that happened when you were younger. Do you think that could be a connection here? Because there's other people that are going to be far more equipped to help us connect the dots. She talks about in the introduction that you have everything you need to do this work, and I appreciate that affirmation.
Yes.
But you also need others at times, because we can be really obstructed or blinded to the things that can help us find our way. And that's so much of what I appreciate about the work of an LPC, is helping to connect those dots and asking a question, do you think this is connected? Because sometimes the answer is, no, I don't think that one actually is connected. I think this is something different.
Exactly.
And that's fine. But that's the cartography that is so important there, that I think you do in this kind of work, is to help us map that route. All right, we're going to get into landmarks in the next chapter. But in this one, I think we were talking before that one of the critical senses is the self, and getting out of your own way to get into this. And she gets into this on page 44 and into page 45 of the book, where she says many caregivers, acknowledging a trauma exposure response can be difficult for any number of reasons. She says many caregivers feel guilty for struggling with their work because they tell themselves, who are they to complain about their lives? There's this great line in here that you pointed out to me before, that I never wanted to give my afflictions any credibility by acknowledging their impact on my life, as that would distract and detract from those who truly suffered. Can you say something about the misery Olympics that people are playing often, of feeling like, well, my suffering isn't this bad. It's not these other people that I'm helping, so therefore I'm unaffected.
Well, and I think the other part of that, Alex, is I'm a licensed professional counselor as my profession. However, it spills over into my life as well, and how I see things and how I respond, or not, be truthful and honest. However, we also meet those people who need to talk everything through, and the one-upping is what it seems like, but it's not. It's that connection, it's that all resonation, it's that recognition of, oh my gosh, I have something that I can relate to because that's what I felt. And so when she says, excuse me, when she says that we're struggling and we have to hold back, we're still human. We are still part of a process. And when it becomes an Olympics is when we need to be saying, okay, I don't need to be in 6 events. I have one event to be in.
Yeah.
And that one event is me and the client. And I don't know if I've ever shared this with you. I welcome God into my space every day, 7 times a day. That's between me and God, where it can hold me. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit later as well. Yeah. However, we don't have a shield of armor on, nor do we want to wear one that will keep us protected and safe and healthy and never have any issues. We are human. That means we have feelings and emotions that pull on us, that tug on us. And when we collaborate with other professionals to be able to say, okay, I need to talk because this is what I felt. I'm new to this position, and with this agency, and within the first week, I went straight to the director. And I said, I need to talk because this, and this has happened to me today, and I'm not okay. And that was during a lunch break, so I had a few minutes more to be able to process it before I could go for the rest of my day. I don't always do that. I don't always recognize it. So it is, we have to qualify for the Olympics.
Yeah.
We don't need to qualify in 7 or 8 events.
Yeah.
We need to understand that what we're feeling isn't tragic. What we're feeling isn't, going to stop us until we don't recognize it.
Yeah. I find in many of the conversations that I have, I use that phrase of the misery Olympics a lot, of reminding people that I talk to in pastoral settings that life is not the misery Olympics. So, like, you might be qualifying in 7 events, and that's, I'm really sorry that that's happening, because it's just a reality. But you're feeling this misery and this pain and this sadness and this grief and this guilt and this anger. I'm jumping ahead into the next section here, but and then I see people who are really quick to dismiss it and want to say that my pain isn't valid. My pain over losing my grandparent at 99 isn't valid because this person that I know lost their 17-year-old son.
Yes.
No. Both can be tragic.
Yes.
Both can be challenging. It's never easy to lose someone we love. This thing that you're experiencing at work might feel privileged, and it might be privileged because you have a job and you have these resources, you have these opportunities that someone else doesn't have, who's unemployed and trying to figure out how to feed 3 children. Yes, that's traumatic too, but you're dealing with your own pain, and let's not distract. And I know we're going to get into talking about minimizing and distraction, and these are all related to this. And I think it really is, as she's lifting up in here, such a tendency of the helper to do this, because we say, I want to help, I want to be compassionate, I feel like I should be doing more, and I should be able to just get through this because I have faith, or because of any number of reasons. The answer is to say, no, sit with it. Run the race you've qualified for here in these Olympics.
Yeah.
Deal with the pain you're feeling. Run that race. Figure out if you've medaled here in the misery Olympics, and move on. And
the other part that really resonates with me right now, what you just said, Alex, is permission. I use that all the time in many different ways, and we have to give ourselves permission, because we're not going to always get it from someone else. As children, we relied on permission from mom and dad, or whoever the caregiver was at that time. I'm not going to limit to mom and dad. We are looking for permission from an employer, from our pastor. How often are we looking just for permission to feel?
Yeah.
I watched a video the other day, Alex, of a police officer literally crying and falling apart on the hood of a car, and all of his co-workers saying, "We got you, man. Go ahead. Let it out." And so we often think that our law enforcement aren't caregivers. They are. They're human too. They don't always like all the aspects of their job. And when they feel, the first thing people want to say is, "Oh, he's not tough enough," or "Oh, she's not tough enough." And we run that risk of having expectations for certain caregivers of what they should or shouldn't feel or have happen. And that's where Laura really helps us all to go, this is expected. You are listening to traumatic events. You are seeing them, feel them, honor them, and then give yourself permission to not hold on. So we can give ourselves the permission. We sometimes need it from somebody else, and I've done that many times in a session.
Yeah.
You hereby have permission to never hold on to that again. Yeah. Here's the floor in the room. Drop it. Let it go. It'll stay right here. You never have to pick it up again.
Yeah. If you need to death grip it right now with me,
yes,
do so. Feel it.
Yes.
Hold on to that as much as it hurts right now, and we're going to figure out how to set it down.
Yes.
When we go. To acknowledge that feeling. And so, yeah, I appreciate what she gets into here of really doubling down on this argument that because you are a helper, because you are a person who cares, because you are a person of faith, because you're a person with all of these tools that you can lean on, it does not make you immune to trauma. In fact, it makes you far more susceptible to this, and what a gift that is.
Yes.
What a gift it is that I can walk open-hearted through the world and have the capacity to be hurt, because I'm willing to also have the capacity to love and care for others. And so, she lifts up a beautiful line in here, with fear that we will open a door that we won't know how to shut, which I have experienced that in clinical settings of, they're like, oh, I don't want to go there. I don't want to open that door because I don't know if I'm going to be able to shut it. And sometimes we just need to open the door and walk through. And I think that's her encouragement here, is to say that we are, with these 16 warning signs that she lifts up in chapter 4. She concludes chapter 3 by saying, people respond to trauma exposure in many ways that are not included in this book. So these index 16 don't mean that we've got the full picture. This is just what her publisher gave her room to put in here. But she's included the common experiences. She reminds us to remain curious, take deep breaths, and maintain a sense of humor as you consider how this information applies to you. Only by understanding the topography of the land that you are lost in can you begin to plot the wisest way out. So let's step into the wilderness here. Let's take a look at the landmarks that are around us in the wilderness. Chapter 4 really seems to be, for me, the heartbeat of this book, of lifting up the 16 warning signs of trauma exposure response. And it starts with a big one, feeling helpless and hopeless. I think this is one of the, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, this might have been what drove me, so I can only speak from my experience, but a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, I feel, is what drives a lot of folks to engage in a clinical setting for counseling and for care. Do you experience that in your work?
Absolutely. What we find is how to not feel is a hurdle, is a really, really big hurdle. How to not feel hopeless or helpless, because it is so... sorry, I'm going back to a movie reference of James and the Giant Peach.
Yeah.
And here comes the rhino in the clouds, and it's the rhino that he's afraid of. And so that feeling of, I can't do anything because that rhino is coming at me, and he's big and scary, and that's what hopelessness and helplessness feels like. It's big and it's scary. And with help, we can break it down. Help for the caregiver, help for the person who has suffered the trauma to begin with.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of scenarios. She lifts up a few that are in here, but I think these kind of things can be big and small. We've got a case study profile that's lifted up here from a professor of biology who talks about his work as an ecologist and working with species that were going extinct, and he was doing work actively watching them go extinct, and the toll that took on him to watch that. And we lift up. She lifts up some other aspects in here of care for creation, talking about doctors in different settings. I've seen this from my background in my undergraduate degree being public health education. I did a lot of work in HIV and AIDS intervention globally. And in some of these big settings, when we're talking about extinction events and climate change and epidemics of various diseases, it's really easy to feel helpless and hopeless in the face of something that seems so enormous.
Yes.
But I think, from what you're saying there, I'm reminded that people can feel that in the face of much smaller events as well, on a grand scale, to say, the loss of a loved one, particularly the loss of someone suddenly or violently, those kind of things of saying, I'm never going to be happy again. I'm feeling hopeless in the face of this. This awareness of a way that a system that was once beloved has changed. There's a lot of different things that can leave us feeling hopeless and helpless, and that, and I appreciate that that's the number one sign that's here for our response to trauma, because trauma is pain. It is pain, and there are many different things that can inflict that. So it's not just the big thing. Tied to the big things is her next idea here, is a sense that one can never do enough. And I love her New Yorker cartoon of one penguin flying while the others are saying, we just haven't been flapping them hard enough. Oh, how often I've felt like a penguin. If I just flap my wings harder,
yes,
I'm going to get through this. Mm-hmm. What does that kind of sense look like from your perspective? Have you seen penguins trying to flap so hard they fly?
I've seen dogs trying to fly. It's amazing how often we as humans say, I'm not doing enough. The question is, who's measuring that?
Yeah.
And understanding that we have an obligation to ourselves. And, it goes back to the whole work ethic and everything else and what's expected of us and 40 hours or 80 hours or whatever. There is a limit to what we can offer each time we are experiencing something, sitting with someone, living our life, that we have to say, I'm okay with this. This is what I'm going to give. This is how I'm going to give it, and that's me. And that's enough.
I think I love that sense of coming back to your language before of permission giving, of giving myself permission to be enough. Saying you are enough, but you have enough that's around you that's convincing you that you're not. And the way she frames it here in this section on a sense that one can never do enough is talking about the language of oppression, which I want to be wary of that. Speaking from a privileged perspective, I don't want to talk about myself as an oppressed category of people lightly. But she's lifting up points here of the way that there are larger societal factors, there's larger movements in our world today that may be part of what's making us feel like we're not enough, that we have these perpetual lies around us of you are not beautiful enough without this product, particularly as we're recording this around the holiday season. You are not a good enough husband or wife or son or daughter or parent if you don't buy XYZ jewelry.
Yep.
There are so many things that are convincing us that we're not enough, and she is talking about this as being a larger framework of systematic oppression, and this scarcity mindset that comes about it. So there is a radical act to the permission giving for self to be enough.
Yes,
and so I'm grateful for any kind of work that can come along and say you are enough, and you don't need to internalize these systems of oppression that are around you and asking for more. It's not saying absolve yourself of all responsibility completely and don't go to work tomorrow. Maybe you do need to leave an unhealthy job if that's the reality of it, but let's be discerning about that. But also, you don't need to let your job kill you. Like where there's a balance that we're finding in this of enough, because enough doesn't necessarily imply too much, and nor does it imply scarcity. And so that is a middle ground rather than an extreme, and I think that can be lost in a narrative of extremes. Yes,
and remembering that advertisers are just doing that, and they don't get it right every time. They will misadvertise and have no idea of the population it's affecting. And then when somebody who's already feeling oppressed listens to an advertisement and it's the trigger, it's the thing that sets them, well, maybe I'm not. And then we start questioning. So it's believing in yourself to be able to say, wait, that's what they are doing. Doesn't mean that's what I have to do. That's hard. And a lot of times we need help with that.
Yeah. And that is, I think, being able to have that other voice in our life that's helping us ask those good critical questions. Because when we get caught up in the whirlwind and the gravity of some of these larger systems that are at play, it can be really easy to miss things, and to have someone in our life that maybe just for that time they're grounded enough to be able to ask the good question of us is such a gift.
Or help me understand, I heard this, I need to talk it out with someone. And they bring that other perspective, and they are hearing what you're saying without it just being a rhetorical question. We don't want to get lost in asking a question that we might not get the answer we're looking for. So how do we also navigate that to be able to communicate, to say, I am struggling. This does not make any sense to me. I need someone else's idea or thoughts, because I'm taking it in a way that I'm going down a rabbit hole that I don't want to come out of. Help me block that hole so I don't go down there.
Yeah. Well, so the maybe a sort of an equal opposite reaction here to our not feeling like we've done enough is her next idea of hypervigilance. And that's, I think that is another, it's just as easy to fall into that. And she talks about this effect happening to people over time who are regularly bearing witness to other people's traumas. Having a trauma exposure response can make us feel like we're always on, even during times where there's absolutely nothing that can or should be done. You mentioned earlier, the ways that you will sometimes bring the clinical practice into your own life,
right? For
better or for worse, I think, because there's times where you might be asking yourself, why am I doing this? I don't want to be
absolutely
analyzing here. And I will notice the same kind of thing for me in conversations where I'm like, no, I'm allowed to not be Pastor Alex today. I can just go to this JMU game and be Alex's sports fan. I still want to stay true to who I am as a person and be ethical and responsible and compassionate and all that jazz. But I don't have to be a pastor today. I can just be going to a JMU game.
That's when it becomes Alex the fanatic, not just sorry. Yeah, I couldn't leave that one out.
I'll at least paint my face purple so I'm less recognizable when that happens.
Well, and it is healthy to be able to say, no, I'm not wearing a counselor hat today. I'm not wearing the flea collar. Sorry, the clerical collar. I'm not putting on gloves and a mask because I'm going to do something medical with someone. I can look at someone. I've met so many wonderful people through church and other places that have said, that's a question I'm not going to answer because I am not your doctor.
Right.
And the gift of setting that, to be able to say, no, I'm going to get sucked in if I tell you too much. I'm not your care provider. I'm a friend who has the same knowledge, but knowing I can't give you that. And that's healthy.
Yeah, and you mentioned not wearing the collar. Ironically, I'm not wearing my collar right now as we record this. But for me, I get asked a lot, why do you wear your collar? For me, that is it's a sign for myself of recognizing what hat, or in this case, what collar I'm wearing at the moment, to say, no, I am not living out my pastoral vocation right now. I am just going to the grocery store, and I'm going to continue to try to be myself, but I'm not wearing my collar because that's not what I'm doing right now. Exactly. But when I show up to work, I'm wearing this, and that's a distinction for me. Am I going to go to this event wearing a collar, or am I going to go wearing a polo? Am I showing up in a long sleeve T-shirt? Sometimes it's because it's a youth event. We're going out. We're going out to an event out at Eagle Eyrie. But more often than not, for me, I love that physical sign of saying, this is the hat I'm wearing right now. This is the role, because it is a means of stopping that hypervigilance. And so there are some, I think with this kind of effect, there are some physical things that people can do where, you can say, this is my office. And when I'm here, I'm doing this kind of work. And unless this appointment is scheduled to be in another place, which I'm guessing is probably seldom happens, you say, this is not my clinical setting. Right. This is my space. Now I can bring some of those gifts and that compassion to this other place. I can bring my faith
Yes.
to another place without bringing my pastoral presence, without bringing my vocation of this. I can bring my knowledge of mental health and transference and some of these to my relationships and to my family without being their counselor.
Right.
Because hypervigilance can be something that is just really letting us completely burn down.
And a lot of times, the way hypervigilance shows up is stress, headaches, talking rapid speech, changing. I mean, it almost looks ADHD.
Yeah.
Because it becomes so, I don't know if it's excessive juggling or I have to move this tractor trailer sized tire 10 feet or 1 inch. Whatever it is, we all of a sudden really focus on, we lose sight of how we are not taking care of ourselves because it shows up differently. And it's not any skill. It is, but it's not. It's not a needed skill. Hypervigilance isn't a needed skill at all times.
Yeah. I was thinking that hypervigilance was an opposite to the feeling like we're not doing enough, but I think that feeling like we're not doing enough might be a balance point between hypervigilance and hopelessness.
Yeah. Oh.
And I'm like, I'm going to stave off my hopelessness by overworking the problem. And if I am always on and I am always working and I am always helping, then I am not hopeless. Meanwhile, it's balanced on this sense of I can never do enough, and so therefore I can never be off. I can never give myself that permission to rest and renew and step back and look at where I am and how I'm hurting, because I always have to help. There's always more to do, and I love people who help, and I see some people who have tremendous hearts who care so deeply for people and the needs of the community, and then there are absolutely moments where I want to look at them and say, please stop.
Yes.
Please rest.
Yes.
Please rest. Because, I can see the ways this is hurting you. You're not seeing this for yourself, but your hypervigilance is ultimately self-defeating.
Yes.
And it comes from a place of, I think of this, I can never possibly do enough. And give yourself the permission for that to be okay.
And the clinical part, the clinical piece is of where I would encourage people and someone to bounce the thoughts off of, or a loved one or a friend, whatever it is. It's not the why question. Why questions spin around in the air. It is being able to say, tell me more. Okay, you've told me this part of it. You've told me how if you do this, this will work. Okay, now tell me what the next part is. And then we look back to be able to go, you've laid out 18 things that you have to do when we have one. That is all that's necessary. So it's not a question of why do you do it. It's help me understand what you're putting in order. Then we can back it around to what is actually needed.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That perspective is important in helping us put first things first and not trying to do all the things at once.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, she gets into these next couple ideas that are here, and I think these next two are pretty intimately related to one another. There's this idea of diminished creativity that can go on and be a sign of trauma and the way that we are hurt. I think that can be a reflection of our hopelessness. There is to not be as creative as we were, and to not feel like we've got that fertile ground for growth of ideas in our heart and soul. But I think it goes hand in hand with her next idea of being the inability to embrace complexity, because creativity, I think, is relishing and celebrating complexity, and when the world is black and white, when you're only able to live within these very rigid dynamics because everything else is so overwhelming, then I think those two are often going to go hand in hand.
I will not argue with you a bit there. That I agree. Yes.
So, I mean, do you see ways of being able to, sorry, I'll think this question through before I actually ask it. when we're talking about this from a sense of people who want to help, I think there really is a danger in a lack of complexity, because the world is complex, and ultimately we can end up hurting people and hurting ourselves by living in this sort of black and white, yes and no, A, B, clear-cut dichotomy of life. What are some of the ways that you've seen people kind of get stuck in that thinking, or in a lack of complexity? How does that look for people?
Well, as you just said, it looks very, very different for everyone. And the lack of complexity means what we usually see is a giving up, that I'm only going to... So it's the reverse of hypervigilance or being hyper-focused. It's, no. If I give so much and I give the details and I go to where it needs to be to embrace the complexity, learning about a new theory in counseling, learning about a new skill in nursing, finding a new treatment for cancer, and you work in the cancer ward. It's, oh no, I don't want to learn that because that's one more thing I have to be aware of. And that's one more thing I might forget, and I can't go wrong with them. I can't do anything that I might harm them. And so not embracing the complexity is actually stifling their own growth, as you said. And so we see it differently. We see it with interests or what they're doing outside of their work. I don't want to get the new bike or the electric bike. I don't want to do that because then I might have too much interest over here and I'll forget why I'm doing the job I'm doing. And then maybe I want to become an Olympic competitor, in marathons or try whatever. This is another one where it will surprise you. This is one where they don't see this coming. The complexity, the not wanting to engage and embrace complexity and not wanting to be creative are subtle enough, they'll get missed.
Yeah. And I think that it is a really easy one to miss, particularly some of the examples that she lifts up in here. She talks about some very very non-confrontational issues, terrorism and war and domestic violence and yes. Those kind of things where they are issues that require complexity. And she lifts up in this same section kind of a zero-sum power system that happened in the wake of the terrorist attacks. And I remember growing up in this dynamic of where there is an element that's here of you're either with me or you're with the terrorists. That's the line that she uses here. And that came after a profound national trauma.
Yes, it did. And I remember all of the comments that were made offhanded, and because of the concerns and because of the fears and because of the unknown, when we don't look at the complexity, even now, Alex, the Gaza, what is happening there, if we don't talk about it, we're acting as though it doesn't happen. And that's a trauma response.
Yeah.
We cannot imagine. Yes, we had our own terrorist attacks here. Mm-hmm. The continuous bombing, the continuous murdering of human life for no reason.
Yeah. And yeah, I've seen that in the wake of the violence that was experienced in Israel, where people see that violence and they're remembering the violence that we've experienced in this country. Will say, well, no, this is clear cut. You're either pro-Israel or you are pro-terrorist. And you say, well, no, it's not that black and white. No. It is a very complex dynamic. Like there's a long history of instability here that we need to know. And the idea that I can still grieve the tragedy that we've witnessed in this country while recognizing that terrorism doesn't come from a vacuum. That an act of lashing out like that doesn't happen without something causing it. And it's not to say that then the violence that follows is deserved, but there's so much complexity in that when we are hurting, we are unwilling to wade into the waters of that. And I think, I see so many more conversations that are happening now in regard to American response to 9/11 and the war on terror that has ensued, conversations that never would have happened in 2002 or 2003 because of how much we were still profoundly hurting.
Yes.
We're having these conversations in hindsight. And so, when I was thinking about the reason for talking about this book, being in the midst of the profound trauma that's happened all around us
yes.
with this pandemic, if to say we are all hurting, we are all witnesses to trauma, then we are going to be less willing to engage in the complex conversations that are needed so desperately to right wrongs that are going here. The George Floyd shooting in Minneapolis and the rise of this Black Lives Matter movement that happened in 2020, and there was a lot of really important conversations and a lot of really important forward progress that was happening. But so much of this was happening side by side with millions of people dying from this virus and so many people living traumatized and in fear. We weren't in an emotional space to have some of those conversations because of how much people were hurting. We're like, this country is getting so divided. Yes, because out of a trauma response, we are becoming less complex.
Yes,
we are unable to embrace complexity because we're hurting and we're not acknowledging it. And that is really shaping the dynamic of a lot of these conversations. And that's been, I think, I'm sure you've seen this in your work. I've had this kind of conversation with colleagues of mine, of people are struggling to engage in nuanced conversation. And that's, reading this, that was a mind-blowing moment for me as I read this section. I'm like, this is a trauma response.
Yes.
We're hurting and we can't do this. We can't do this. And I think that hands off perfectly to the next section here, which is minimizing.
Yes.
And as I said before we started recording, we don't have to talk about this one. But no, it's right there. We're minimizing an issue. It's clear cut. It's black and white. You're either pro-American or you're pro-terrorist. There's no other way. That is minimizing a conflict in a profound way.
And for caregivers and for the people who are on the front lines, who experience the trauma in other ways and vicariously and secondhand, what we ourselves catch ourselves doing is minimizing what's happening because we're also recognizing who can and can't talk about it. So we minimize to make the session and less traumatic. Then we forget and we keep doing it when the next person may not, or the next day. So whatever we feel and we take on, we have to be able to catch. And that's with the help of others.
Yeah. Well, we talk about this. This is a lot of what we've talked about now is involving our thinking. It's involving the way that we process and respond in our vocational response. The next warning sign that she lifts up here is chronic exhaustion and physical ailments. And there was another book that we referenced in our conversation before we recorded about the body keeps score. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us about this kind of phenomenon, because it goes beyond the mental.
It is, and our psychological and physical being is together. We can't separate them out. And so even the amount of mental work we do takes a toll on our bodies. And stress literally can kill you, because the stress and anxiety is going to mess with your central nervous system, and we are going to, at some point, not be able to do any more. It is not uncommon to get to the end of your work week and your colleagues say, I'm done. I cannot do anymore. I just want to go take a nap. Mm-hmm. And that is recognizable. It's being verbalized. What isn't being verbalized a lot of times with chronic exhaustion and physical ailments is you start calling out. And I need to take, or all of a sudden I'm going to take a 3-day vacation next week. Then it goes back to a lot of the other same warning signs.
Yeah. Now, there's a difference there between I am going to take a day to care for my health, or I'm going to be intentional about taking this 3-day weekend to care for myself, and I am so overwhelmed that I physically can't come into work today, and I don't know why.
Yes.
This is so frustrating.
Yes.
I just need to keep pushing through. And so that is, I don't want to shame anyone out of the healthy vacation.
Right. Because we'll get to that later. Right. You're going to get to that later with another guest of talking about self-care.
Yeah.
And talking about healing and talking about how there are many effective ways to keep us going in these professions, not having as many trauma responses, and being able to embrace the growth, and being able to embrace what can help us, not only what is locking us and shutting us down. Yeah.
It's the physical. The physical is a real big factor because we can. And I think one of the clear examples of that is someone looks at pictures of a president when they start their term and when they finish their term, and you can see how rapidly someone in a high-stress job like that ages. And it does. It really does physically affect our health. And that is something not to be diminished or missed at all in this conversation. The next warning sign is the inability to listen or deliberate avoidance. And I know avoidance tendencies are a big thing, but the inability to listen here. This, I think, also paired with her next idea of dissociative moments.
Yes.
Can you say more about this section and what this can kind of look like for somebody?
Where I have seen this happen is when the inability to listen directly affects, and then when you're half hearing, the response you give can be totally inappropriate, can be harmful. And so deliberate avoidance is you're checking out and you don't want to face any of it, or you're finding that the normal day-to-day structure is off and it's not working, so therefore you're not engaged with it. And so it also goes to the personal life there as well. I'm trying to pull my thoughts together for the dissociative moments and how we take it one step further when we don't need to. Checking out, not really being there, noticing experiences, avoiding isolation, seeking out support is what we should be doing, but these are two we can't catch quickly. They're going to come on slow and they're going to gradually get worse. Yeah. They're going to keep building.
Yeah, and she describes them as being intrusive or overwhelming feelings.
Yes.
So this isn't about I'm going to go turn my mind off for a minute and just watch a silly show that makes me happy. This kind of thing happens without volition, and it builds. I think that is an important thing to recognize in there, because there is a big difference between saying, I need a minute for myself. I need to just go kind of collect my thoughts, or I need a minute to go just dissociate.
Yes.
I've heard people say that, and I don't think that's inherently unhealthy. because there is volition in that. It's where, the example that she used in the introduction of this book of the cliffside moment of how many people do you think have died jumping off of this cliff? That's an intrusive thought. That's an intrusive moment. You have just dissociated from the beautiful reality you're in with your family to have that experience there, and that was not something of your own volition,
right?
And so I think that can be one of the things that people can look for in their own experiences there of say, I have these times where I just become overwhelmed and my mind just turns off, or I'm flashing back to another time where I'm re-experiencing this trauma. That is when we're branching into a warning sign of trauma exposure response versus I'm deliberately stepping away to take care of myself. Yes.
And as I said, these are the ones that are going to sneak up on you. They're going to grab you. And by then, it's already been happening for a while. So, yeah, I'm jumping ahead of you, just the sense of persecution.
Yeah.
That because these have been happening, what's going on, it's not being talked about, it's not being addressed. These characteristics are building. Bam.
Yeah.
We have a bigger situation for the helper.
Yeah. And she lifts that up as to say feeling persecuted speaks to a feeling of profound lack of efficacy in one's life. That's her opening remark here, is to say that this is, again, not happening by our own volition. This is this snowball of helplessness in a situation that's making us say, I am being persecuted, or as she describes it here, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mistreatment can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everyone's out to get me. I've had this, and this bad experience, and now everyone is against me. And my job could not possibly get any worse because everyone is out there just to tear down my job and make me feel like dirt. Well, maybe. But maybe not.
Exactly.
And maybe that this spiral of thought is something that you need some help stepping in and breaking because you're beginning to weave a new reality for yourself that isn't grounded in what we're experiencing here and now, and that can be dangerous. Again, that feeling lost in the wilderness.
Yes.
When we're creating surroundings for ourselves that aren't there, there are enough roadblocks that we don't need to manufacture them for ourselves.
And this is where, if we're counting, I don't even know where we are in the count, and we're counting and we're bringing out these 16 that she has chosen. Again, she gives us clear direction that these are not all of them. But here are 16 very important responses that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and very common.
Yes.
You were talking about what's normal.
Yes.
This is a very normal set of abnormality. And
exactly.
So, and I started feeling that as I was getting into this section of I'm being attacked here because she's naming too much of what I've experienced in my own life, and too much of what I've had to go unpack in my own therapy, and like that has been really helpful, but I'm like, man, that's me. Stop. And it can be frustrating.
And the harder part, Alex, is when someone that a colleague is saying, well, I'm glad that never affects me. I would never let that happen. There's a bigger sign. Oh, I'm fine. Nothing bothers me. Mm-hmm. No, I'll be able to handle it when it comes. No. Yeah,
and I think that's one of the things I always try to lift up in preaching and in teaching and in pastoral care conversations and working with others is that it's okay to be vulnerable.
Yes.
I'm more than happy to be vulnerable in that. But again, there's volition in that. It's, what we're talking, when it becomes a problem is when my vulnerability is not of my own making. When I can't help but sit there and be broken open for the world to see. That's when I'm not handling things well. That's when I'm hurting and I'm traumatized. And that happens. And sometimes there's nothing, it's not to say there's anything wrong with that, but that's a time when we say, we need to get help. We need support in this, in helping to piece ourselves back together, because we're hurting out in the open, rather than by our own volition sharing from our vulnerabilities. And a lot. I thought it was well timed as I was like getting into this section again. I'm feeling way too seen, and then she lifts up guilt. And because as I'm naming all these things, I'm like, I am failing as a person for the ways that I have resonated with so much of what has come before in this chapter. Now it gets to guilt, and this, the experience of trauma exposure, and a way of responding is to feel guilty about the way that we're experiencing life. What is fundamentally wrong with guilt from, or I won't say fundamentally wrong, I don't know if that's the right word, but where do you see guilt as being dangerous or problematic for someone?
It's taking on a life of its own that is our projecting. I have to feel guilty because someone else, it's much worse. They have it much worse. I've got to feel guilty for anything I'm doing. So it's taking our lives out of normalcy and creating something else that doesn't need to be created. We can feel however we need to feel. Understanding why we're feeling it is key. Understanding the reason we need to give life and breath and air to guilt is because maybe we're questioning how we went about something. Maybe it's a sense of I'm realizing how privileged I am. You don't have to feel guilty about what you're privileged with. It's what you do with that privilege. And that's where for many, that line gets blurred of what guilt is. If I may, for a quick moment, the birth of my child, I felt very guilty that it wasn't worse, wasn't more complicated, because I had lost the twin. Where it came later was, no, I didn't need to feel guilty for the actual birth defects. What was going to come later with a divorce was even bigger than anything I saw with the birth of my child. I could have handled more. I could have done this. Well, handling the divorce wasn't easy.
Yeah.
So that moment of guilt, and then having somebody, I didn't go through that by myself, Alex.
Yeah.
A lot of pastors here at Muhlenberg helped me through that. What we know to be true is we can blame, shame, and guilt ourselves. However, it's not a benefit. There is no benefit in guilting yourself into feeling a specific way that you're shaming yourself, because there's no room for either one of those. We have to understand the reason we are making those choices, and then what do we do with it?
And that sense of what do we do with this, and I think, from a perspective of someone of faith, to say, what do we let God do with this? Because I get that I get that question a lot when I talk to people about, well, why do we have to start every worship service with confession? Like, am I that bad? Well, I would say, all right, don't read Luther, because he would say, yeah, you are that bad. You're the worst. And that's, this wretched sinner that I am. Luther was unapologetic about feeling guilt, but he was also unapologetic about laying guilt down at the foot of the cross.
Yes.
and letting it's a little of a cliche phrase of the letting go and letting God.
Yeah.
But saying I can feel this, I can acknowledge this, I can see the ways that this would immobilize me, but I'm laying my guilt down here, and I'm going to walk in freedom, and I'm going to walk in newness of life, and to say that this is what grace does. This is the way that grace transforms. Is it gives me a place to lay down guilt and shame, and to walk in a new way. Because if we don't, and we continue to carry this, then I think it leads us into the next warning signs here, which is that of fear. And then anger and cynicism, which go hand in hand As a big Star Wars fan, Yoda says fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. She actually does quote that.
Yes,
in here, The Phantom Menace. Again, I'm listening to this book on audiobook while mowing my yard. I'm fist pumping in my neighborhood because she's quoting The Phantom Menace when talking about fear. But it is this very clear cut pathway. I think guilt can be something that when we don't let it go can transform there immediately into fear.
And where I want to jump in here is there's this piece of trust. I don't trust myself. I don't trust the system. I don't trust God. I don't trust my neighbor. I don't trust my spouse. I don't trust my friend. I don't trust myself. And then it just makes all of this more complex. Because fear, yes, I want you to have fear. Because it helps you find what needs to be sifted through and what needs to be held and what needs to be molded and what needs to be shaped. So fear, okay, but too much is what we're talking about. We're talking about where it gets to be too much. Anger and cynicism, yes, be angry. Know what you're angry about. If you're angry for no reason, and I mentioned to you earlier, fear and anger, I had to realize that and go, whoa, okay, this is a warning sign for me. I've got a little too much fear of things I don't have any control or any business needing to fear. And then I'm angry at all the little things. That's when I had to go back to figure out where my trauma response was. Because anger showed up very ugly. And the cynicism and the rudeness. I found myself having rudeness, and I didn't like it. And that's when you get a look from somebody, you make a comment, and somebody just looks at you, almost like you just did to me.
Yeah.
It's that look of, I can't believe that just came out of your mouth.
Yep.
And what is happening here? Because someone else will see it and feel it when it's so uncharacteristic of us. And that's not to look at them and go, what's your problem? That's the time to look at them and go, okay, Alex, I did not understand that face. Help me understand the face you just made for what I said. And so there are ways to be able to bring that back around and sort through it.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said there about I don't trust myself, I don't trust my neighbor, I don't trust God, I don't trust that, because oh my gosh, that sounds like so many conversations that I have heard either over the last few years, the trauma that in the midst of the trauma we've experienced, when people looking around at the brokenness in our country, in our political systems, and our ability to have conversations within our communities, you're saying, I don't understand what's wrong. I don't understand what's changed. But you know what? I don't trust this. I don't trust this. I don't trust this. I don't trust this doctor. I don't trust this vaccine. I don't trust this. I don't trust. And that lack of trust is the fear that then turns to anger and action running amok, and it becomes really problematic. And I hear so often people talk about everyone seems angry and cynical. Now that's casting a wide net. And I know not everybody's angry and cynical, but it can feel like that. It can, that hopelessness that we let off this chapter talking about, of saying I feel like everyone is angry and cynical, and it does come back to that lack of trust that is so hard.
And as we do that, Alex, you and I both know the two things people do not want to admit are what they fear and how angry they are. Because already, what right do I have? Or the reason they're so angry is this big to them. It's deep. The anger goes deep for what they've experienced, yet that isn't coming across. It's looking like everything now when we have to find a way to get to those lower surfaces. That's where we can work through it, and that's where we can name it, and that's where we can help them take ownership of only the piece they need to, because it's much smaller.
I appreciate that. Yeah, fear and anger are healthy emotions, but too much of them can be can be really problematic. And I think, Luther offering his explanation of each of the 10 commandments in the Small Catechism begins each explanation of a commandment by saying we are to fear and love God. And I every time I teach confirmation kids get hung up on, we're to fear God? Mm-hmm. See, yeah. Like, have you stood on top of a mountain and had your breath taken away? As you stand there on an edge and you feel really, really high up, and like this could all fall apart in an instant if I'm not careful. I feel like, but it's also breathtaking and it's beautiful and it's wonderful and I love this. I feel like that's the balance of fear and love, but it's fear balanced with love.
Yes,
that we live in awestruck wonder of our God, and to say that there is a role for fear in our relationship with God, and because fear isn't a problematic emotion, but it can be if we let it run.
When they become a trauma response, that's when trauma exposure response. That's when we run into the blockage. Yeah.
So rolling right out of that sense of the anger and the frustrations and the ways that this can manifest, I see this so much come up in forms of walls that people put up in unhealthy ways between themselves and reality. And there's the next two warning signs, I think, go hand in hand with that, and they go hand in hand with each other. One is the inability to empathize / numbing. Mm-hmm. And I think another tool of numbing is the next one, which is addictions.
Yes.
And so turning to substances, turning to sort of foreign things to then be the agent of healing, in big air quotes here, because this is a podcast and people can't see that, because it's not healing, and it's a way of distracting in a really devastating way. And I absolutely love and adore frontline healthcare workers who work in trauma bays and ERs. But I remember when I was working as a trauma chaplain in a trauma bay in West Philadelphia, when I was working doing rotations by day in the hospital, nurses and doctors on the regular floors of the hospital would make some dark humor jokes, and then they would notice that the chaplain walked by, and they'd get bashful about it. The ER trauma nurses, trauma surgeons, they did not care. The dark humor was up. That was a wall that kept them from feeling the enormity of what they were experiencing as they were literally holding the fragility of life in their hands.
Oh my gosh, yes.
But then I also noticed that as a problem. I mean, they were hilarious. Like I had to make it really clear to them quickly. I'm like, your jokes aren't offending me. I think y'all are funny, and I understand what this is. Mm-hmm. But then, I remember a time when a man came in who had fallen on train tracks, and when they got him in, they recognized that he was on drugs and his BAC was really high. And when they saw substances, they wrote him off. Mm-hmm. And as I followed up with him, I realized that, he was talking about hearing voices. And I recognized that from our conversation that he was hearing voices before he fell on the tracks. That it wasn't about him drinking. Yes. It wasn't about the drugs that he was using, but he'd been hearing voices before that, and I was able to go back to the doctors and advocate for him, and they were able to get a psych consult, and they were getting him transferred over to an inpatient psychiatric evaluation at the main hospital. Mm-hmm. And so the numbing that happened was really detrimental to this patient had there not been someone else like me there.
Yes.
Because the inability to empathize with someone when they saw, you made a choice to do these drugs, and you decided to fall, and you're fine. You just sit there and sober up, and then we're going to kick you right back out on the street. That was really, really dangerous to this man who was in a mental health crisis at the time. And so there's a lot of these caring professions where that same kind of numbing with things like humor or distancing from, choice pains that people would take on will then transfer over for addictions for themselves. And there can be such a hand-in-hand correlation with that.
Yeah.
What kind of things have you seen in
all of that? Everything you've just talked about, I've seen and I've worked with in different settings in my career. And what happens many times is that one glass of wine on Friday night because I'm off for the weekend, which is then more on Saturday, more on Sunday, and they're hungover when they come into work on Monday. And so, however, nobody wants to admit they have an addiction. No one does. Not in the beginning, because it is soothing them. It is helping them. To inability to empathize or the numbing, those are protective devices. And so is the addiction. So it's not right. However, this has been happening for years. These are some of the quick fixes to get through tough situations.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important element here of this wilderness cartography here, and as we're mapping our response to trauma exposure, then we need to be really wary of quick fixes.
Yes,
and substances are an inherently quick fix, and humor is important, maintaining a good sense of humor, but dark humor that's really putting up a wall between us is a quick fix towards numbing the pain of what we're experiencing, and not experiencing that pain by choosing to do that. And so, so much of what we've talked about so far has been this hard work that's needed of really digging deep and really doing that personal soul work. And we're going to get into that in the next episode of this podcast as we get into our third section, if my numbers are correct in my head here. That's where we're really going to get into doing that internal work, and we're going to have some great conversations around that because this is quick fix, but the kind of things that we're talking about here are longer. This is opening the door that we don't know if we're going to be able to close it. That sentiment she brought at the very beginning of this chapter. And so her 16th warning sign of trauma exposure response is grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance related to one's work.
I love that cartoon.
The first one, or
the couple out to dinner.
Yeah. Must
you precede everything you say with "This is your captain speaking"? That's good humor, because it's a simple way to say how they're elevating themselves. Don't question me. When, again, we might be getting projecting in there. You're questioning me? Well, I'm questioning myself, but I don't want you to know that. So how do we maintain our identity, maintain structure, maintain confidence when we are questioning? And so we're going to go into different areas. We're going to say, I am all that and a side of fries, or I have to work longer, I have to work harder, I have to do more. And then it comes back to some of the other 16 that we've already talked about. But we lose sight so quickly on reality.
Yeah, I think when we lose sense of reality, we struggle with putting first things first. And she lifts up a quote from Jenny McCarthy, who she describes as the foremother of the domestic violence movement in the United States, author of several revolutionary books on violence against women, who described the tension she encountered when balancing multiple identities. She said, "There I was, neglecting my own children while I was out trying to change the world." And I think that sense of grandiosity is, we begin to put so much value on ourselves that we begin to let all of these other things down that we said were important, that we know are important, that we still hold. But that element of minimizing, it applies to the things and the people that we love, and that hurts. That hurts the people that we love. That hurts ourselves to see that kind of thing happen. And so, I've certainly seen this among colleagues, and I've seen this amongst myself. I don't know what the way I'm trying to say that for myself. Where my job as pastor is so important and so all-consuming, and it has to be done, that I'm letting my family down, and I'm not there for those that I love the most. And I think that I'm so indispensable. It's got to be me, and I'm so grateful to be in a setting now where, with Pastor Lauren here, I have someone else to say, it doesn't have to be you, it can be me today. Take a day off. Yes. And I can return the favor. And that balance has been so incredibly important for us to maintain in this work. And so I think that we're touching on a lot of these common themes of navigating the wilderness here, of the way that we need to have volition in this, the way that we need to practice intentionality. And I think these are getting into themes that she's really going to be lifting up as we get to the end of this book, is the intentionality by which we approach this. Because a lot of these warning signs are things that are happening without our volition. They're happening without our understanding or our knowledge or our consent. I did not want this to happen to me, and yet here I am. And so I'm curious, looking at all of these, we've got the 16, and I noticed this a little while ago in the front cover of the book. They're all listed in a big circle: feeling helpless and hopeless, a sense that one can never do enough, hypervigilance, diminished creativity, inability to embrace complexity, minimizing, chronic exhaustion / physical ailments, inability to listen / deliberative avoidance, dissociative moments, sense of persecution, guilt, fear, anger and cynicism, inability to empathize / numbing, addictions, and grandiosity.
That's a lot.
It is. And so huge kudos to those that are listening to this podcast that have stuck with us through all of this.
Yes.
Because this really, I do think this is the meatiest section of this book, where she's really trying to get into, these are the things that you need to be looking out for in yourself. So for the sake of any podcast listeners, I hope that you were able to break this up, enjoyed this on a couple different drives to work, or you've sat here and rolled through this whole delightful conversation with us. But I'd like to kind of bring it all together and bring this back home. And from your perspective and your clinical background, I'm curious, what for you is the canary in the coal mine for these signs of trauma response? What clues you in or helps you recognize this in your clients or in yourself that you're embodying trauma?
Interestingly, it's easy to see it in our clients.
Yeah.
Very difficult to see it in ourselves. And I think for me, what I've had to do is become very aware of how my colleagues or friends or family respond to me. If they are responding in a different manner, like, what is your problem? Or you seem really angry. Actually holding on to that, and that's one of the hardest conversations we have with anyone. Tell me what you're seeing. Because we don't want to hear it. You know, if somebody's pointing a finger at you and saying, well, aren't you a little crusty today? Okay, yeah, maybe I am. Or never mind, I don't want to talk about it. We at some point have to acknowledge. So, yes, for me, just me, it's very easy to see in my clients. For me to see it in myself, most of the time I'm pretty good, or I've got that one person who will look at me and go, excuse me, you're different today.
So having that trusted individual can be there to help you with that. I love that, because I think that, you know, that really speaks to the work that you do. You are that trusted individual for others, and being able to have that trusted individual for yourself is also really important, who can call you on that and love, and can name that and love and help you map the wilderness for yourself there. Now, I shared with you and I shared in the introduction to this show about a time when I was feeling exceptionally burnt out and that I was really carrying the trauma. You know, for me, the canary in the coal mine was my preaching, because preaching is probably the thing I love the most about the work that I do. I love that opportunity, and so much of my heart gets poured into that. And yes, I'm trying to preach to the congregation, but I'm human, and so a lot of my preaching is preaching to myself at times, and so that for me can be a sign. And going back and looking at my sermons, and you know, particularly from that period that I was referencing in the introduction, I was referencing a time with a lot of grief, and all of my sermons were about grief, which was relevant to the community, but I should have seen something in that. And so I'm grateful for a colleague who could point that out to me and say, hey, go back and listen to your sermons. One, because you need to hear it, because you're telling all these people that they're enough while you don't believe that for yourself. And also, you're hurting. And so that's been something for me that I've tried to say is I've got this ready-made tool in my work where I can look at this system of reflection every other week and see how I'm doing and check in. And so whether it's, something that you're doing intentionally in writing and reflecting and if it's journaling or something like that, or if it's that trusted confidant who can call you out on it in love when you need that, to be able to tell you, I think that can be a really important part of these trauma, of understanding trauma response, to have somebody who understands this as well, who can be able to raise the flag for you and say you might need to reflect a little bit. You mentioned, the clinical setting, and you talked about seeing this for your clients and seeing this for yourself. I think that kind of related to another question I wanted to ask about was the different lines and means of setting boundaries that you have around the different spaces in your life. You've got relationships and work that are built in a clinical setting, where you have an office where you can say, "Don't worry, you can lay your trauma here." Because as a professional, we're going to leave it here, and I'm not going to carry it home with me because I'm leaving it right here in my office. And that is really beneficial. But you're also a human with family and friends and a church and all these different communities. So how do you handle that same kind of balance in your personal life without the clear-cut clinical boundaries?
It's not easy. It's not easy. And what I have had to do for me is remember the ethical piece, that I am not to cause harm. And if all of a sudden what I feel I need to talk about is any reflection of what I've experienced with a client or a coworker, it's not for me to talk about. And that's when I have to set that boundary for myself. The other part is, who am I reaching out to if I feel a little crusty myself, going, I'm not sure what I'm doing, and who I'm talking to about it? That needs to be a boundary. I need to come to my pastor, go to my own clinician, go to a trusted mentor to be able to say, help me process out what I'm doing. And that's hard, because you can't set the boundary unless you're willing to do the work and knowing what it is. So it all ties in together with all of these little nuances of recognizing, becoming aware, and validating yourself that you are feeling, and it's okay to feel everything you're feeling. Now we need to process it and make sense of it.
So now we've hopefully got folks that are listening to this, that are engaging in this conversation with us, that might be feeling, I know I was as I read this, feeling a little too seen.
Yes.
Like, ooh, this is hitting the nail a little too close to being right on the head for me. And it can, I think I made the comment to my wife as I was reading this book. I said, I feel both super seen and super attacked.
Yes.
Because this is naming hard truths about myself that I don't necessarily want to confront, or bringing up hard truths that I've had to confront and I didn't want to at that time either. It can be hard to hear these things and to recognize this in ourselves. And so where is the grace in this? Where do you see the grace in this hard work that's being asked of us as caring members of communities who also need to be mindful of the fact that we are perhaps the most susceptible to these trauma responses in bearing the secondhand trauma of others? Where's the grace for us?
And I'm going to be very, very careful here, Alex, as you and I have talked about already in this podcast, of it's not if you don't face these, there's no grace for you. And there is not, you get all the grace if you work this through and come out a better person. The grace is, we're not alone. the grace is we are expected to have difficulties in our life. We're expected to have a mountain or a molehill in front of us. We're expected to live and breathe our lives. And if our authentic self is struggling, then the grace is, okay, let's get some help so you don't struggle alone.
I appreciate that. And you know, hearing the people that you've talked about that you rely on, that you lean on, it sounds to me like you're allowing those folks to share grace with you. But because I think the heart of your work and the heart of compassionate work in general is sharing grace. Mm-hmm. I want to be, the prayer of St. Francis, I want to be an instrument of your peace. And I want to be an instrument of grace. I want to share this with the world. And it's a cruel irony that I'm being hurt in the midst of only wanting to share grace. Mm. But there is a beauty in knowing that we're not alone in that there is someone walking with us in this wilderness. There is somebody who's charting this along the way. And there's been a few of those things that came up here where we were, I think, acknowledging, like, that's the grace, that's the care, that's the love that bubbles up, and it can be there. It is graceful to recognize these and to do this work, and it is grace centered to come back to the heart of who we are and to recognize that no, we're not alone in this wilderness. There is someone who is with us, navigating that wilderness as well. And so, as you know, as we talk about that, I think it hands off beautifully here to our reflection, our Bible study for this particular conversation. Wanted to pair all of this again very dense text with another short but brief text. This comes from the book of Luke, from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. This is the temptation of Jesus. It says, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." Then the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said to him, "To you I will give their glory and all this authority, for it has been given over to me, and I give it to anyone I please. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered him, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil took him to Jerusalem and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you. And on their hands they will bear you up, so that you do not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. I love this story of Jesus in the wilderness. I particularly love this from Luke for a really small and weird reason. It's because it's got one of my favorite verses to take out of context in here. I saw a picture one time of a verse a day calendar, and the verse of the day was Luke 4:7. "If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." And it was, the little meme note with it was, great verse, not as fun if you realize who said it, because that was Satan. Exactly. And so when you rip that verse out of context, it's great. So that's just my little my little internal reason for why I love this. But, when we're talking about wandering the wilderness, we've been talking a lot today about the deep personal work that's needed to map our response to trauma. And that doesn't come with easy answers. No. And I love that in here, in this story, Jesus wanders the wilderness and is given easy answers. turn these rocks into bread. You're hungry. There's nothing inherently wrong with bread. But Jesus says no, that he's not taking an easy way out, that he's going to continue in this way in which he has been called. There's he's been taken up to see the kingdoms of the world, and we talk about Jesus having glory and all authority rests on his shoulders. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with Jesus having authority all over all creation. But he's not taking this in the easy way. And yeah, he could have saved himself from being thrown off the pinnacle. He could have done something miraculous. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being saved through an incredible and exemplary divine power. But he said, I'm not doing that. I'm not taking this easy way out. I will be thrown down in Jerusalem, and it's going to matter more that I fall. And so there's so much more of this work that comes from the heart here, because this really shows the heart of who Jesus is in these temptations, that he isn't opting for the easy way out, that he's wanting to do the hard work of following the call that God has given him. And as we wander in the wilderness, and as we are discerning the topography and the pitfalls and the warning signs that are all around us, that isn't easy. Christy, what does it mean to you to hear Jesus experiencing these kind of things here in the wilderness, and to see him face these kind of temptations?
It makes it real. It makes it relatable. It makes it understandable, and it makes it tie into so much when we ourselves hear a passage or study it or try to make sense of it. It's that we could have read it every year through confirmation. We could have read it in our Bible study as a young adult. We can read it or hear it as an adult later. But until we're ready to understand it, it doesn't really apply. So even as you were reading it and talking, I'm hearing things of grace for myself, the ability to know what my strengths and weaknesses are, the ability to hear that God has choices. I often laugh, you always have two choices. That's what I tell my clients. I told my child that early on. We do have two choices. And when we take care and responsibility for making that choice and sticking with it, then we have to own it. And if it turns out to be not a good choice, okay, there's the grace. And the grace we have to have for ourselves as well. So the modeling of what Jesus goes through in the wilderness and making choices and knowing there's grace.
Yeah, there's this feels like such a big divine cosmic battle, and this kind of thing. It feels so big, but when you say it like that, it's so human.
Yes,
I'm just standing in the wilderness with two choices in front of me, and I've got to make a choice. I've got to say this or that. That is so human, and to see God experience that alongside us. I think that is important. That is profound. That is to say that tempted and tested in the same ways that we are by life.
Yes.
Not by some diabolical or sinister plan. This is life. Feed yourself, feed your family by some cheap shortcut, or by staying faithful in this harder course. There's so much of this that I love, because it feels so grounded and so human, even though it is a grand conversation of cosmic significance. It is very real. It is very grounded, and And I think, there is grace even more in knowing we're not alone in that, that we have one who is calling us back to our heart, calling us back to the very heart of ourselves as a beloved child of God, as a recipient of grace, as a compassionate and merciful person, as a creation that was breathed into with the breath of life by our Creator and called good. Come back to that. Come back to who you are. Because I think these 16 warning signs that we've seen are all ways that we know we are straying from ourselves. We talked about getting over ourselves in this. This is coming back. Sometimes we got to get over a hurdle that is us,
yes,
to get back to the heart of who we are. And all of these things: one who provides bread, one who leads with authority, one who is saved from death in Jerusalem. Like that's all Jesus. That's who he is. But he's getting over himself to make a harder choice to live. And to be who he is here. And so each of us has that same kind of choice. So
just to add to that, sometimes we have to get out of our own way. Because we're creating the obstacles. We're creating the mess. And it can all be looked at, evaluated, and not undone, because some of the choices can't be undone. However, if we get out of our way and we look at it differently, there are different lands, there are a different angle, we can see. Now it's time for a new choice.
Yeah. Well, as we were talking about this and planning for this episode, I talked about liking to end with questions, but you asked if we could lift up things that we could be curious about.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that distinction. And so I have a couple curiosities to leave with folks for this week. And one of them is to say, what of these 16 warning signs are you curious about? What do you want to learn more about? Because I think there's a difference there in
sure.
naming, I feel attacked by this one, and like, oh, that's me. End of story. I'm done. I'm a failure. Look at me. I suck. That's not the point. I want to invite that curiosity into one of these to say, I want to learn more about minimizing. What is that resonated a little bit. I want to learn more. I want to sit with that, or I want to walk with that, or I want to ask about that.
Yes.
So I think for me, what of these 16 has inspired that curiosity and let that bubble up to the surface? If people are having these conversations and discussion groups, be ready to get deeper. This is a harder one. This work of self-reflection here is difficult. My other curiosity is, who is in the wilderness with you? Who is a trusted voice in the wilderness? And I want you to be curious about the people that are around you, and to think about the relationships that you have and the conversations that you've been having, because I think those are going to be important to reflect on. We both share the importance of those kind of people in our life. And from a perspective of our story for the day, I'm curious. I want to invite curiosity around the shortcuts that are available to you at the moment, around the choices that you are in the midst of. What are the paths in front of you, and what are you considering as you're doing that? I want you to be curious about the choices that are there. Do you have any curiosities that you'd like to lift up for folks?
Not what I would lift up for folks. I've got my own I've got to work through. But I think the curiosity is, when we are curious, follow it. Lean into it. I wanted to add a piece to who is in the wilderness with you. If in your reflection you see somebody who's not there, go find them. Because that's your inner calling of who you need and who you want. And so the curiosities are going to keep coming up, and they're going to keep happening as we contemplate this further and further in a group and what somebody else brings up and what something is being said, or the elephant in the room, what doesn't get spoken. And be curious of what it holds for you or what you immediately reject. And I think that's the piece of the two choices we have: accept or reject. And all of it is okay. We've got to come to our own answers or gifts as they're presented to us.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Thank you for the conversation today. I think this is probably going to be, this is the meatier section of the book, and it's going to be one of the denser, probably longer episodes that we have here in this study. And so I appreciate you bringing your willingness to engage to this conversation. For those that are listening, I'd like to encourage you to discuss these questions that are these curiosities with a conversation partner. And whatever you're comfortable sharing, you're invited to share your reflections in the comments section of our Muhlenberg Lutheran Facebook page, our Instagram, which can be found at Muhlenberg LC, or on YouTube. So thank you for gathering with us today around the Wellspring. We're looking forward to another episode next week. You can learn more about our congregation online by joining us for worship each Sunday at 8:30 and 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with the 11 o'clock service streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. Your financial support for the ministry of Muhlenberg makes the many ministries, including digital ones like this, possible for our community. You can make your gifts online at www.muhlenberglutheran.org/give. I'm Pastor Alex Zuber, joined today by Christy Trumbo. Thank you for your presence here. I'm so glad we could be together today. I pray that God's grace has bubbled up to meet you wherever you are. Now, go in peace to live out Christ's love.